St. Thomas Episcopal Church. The Lord be with you.
Also with you.
Let us pray. God, we admit we often wonder if you still speak to people today as you once did to people in the Bible. But as this class has progressed, it has occurred to us that maybe we've been thinking about this all wrong. Maybe you've not stopped talking. Maybe we've stopped listening. Maybe we've forgotten how to listen. Maybe we no longer recognize your voice. What if the Bible doesn't just contain things you once said to people long ago? What if your word is as alive and active today as it ever has been? What if that's more than just a neat-sounding metaphor? What if it's the one clue that might yet turn our lives inside out, upside down? Well, as the psalmist once asked of you, so we pray with sudden expectation. God, dig out our ears. We want to hear you again. Amen. And if you wonder where the psalmist said that, it's in Psalm 40, verse 6. But as is often the case in so many English translations, they have put in a euphemism there. It just says, God, open our ears in most English translations. But it's God, dig out our ears. All right, so the last couple of weeks we've been looking at English translation. We started all the way back with the Venerable Bede and spent quite a bit of time with the King James Bible. One of those translations that probably most of us used when we were children, maybe even well into our adulthood. Still the case that supposedly 55% of all English-speaking people are still using regularly the King James Bible. I find that a little hard to believe, but that's what the stats say. Then last week we worked through really translations since then. We worked through the British RV and the American ASV, and then worked our way quickly through a lot of 20th century translations. Today, for the most part, I want to switch our attention away from the versions and look at paraphrases of various kinds, or at least looser translations of the Bible into English. And then, assuming we have time, end with some thoughts about parallel Bibles and study Bibles, and if we really have enough time, a handful of items to think about in terms of selecting a Bible if you're going to go out and purchase one. So let's start with just a couple of really review kinds of definitions. A manuscript, where we started 2.5 months ago now. A manuscript is a handwritten copy of the Bible, whether it's Old Testament or New Testament, which means it's going to be in Greek or in Hebrew, essentially. The term does get stretched a bit, so it allows for translation into Latin or Syriac or Ethiopic or any of those other very, very old languages, but nothing that we would consider a living language today. Manuscripts could be written on papyrus, they could be written on vellum, they could be put into a scroll, they could be in a codex, like our today books. A translation is just that. It is a version of a manuscript that has been put into the vernacular of another people. So whether it's Chinese, French, Spanish, English, all of those are translations out of Greek and Hebrew. A version, often, though not always, is the end result of a team of people working together on it. If you remember from a couple of weeks ago, the King James Bible had 33 scholars working on it. Not all of them have been named, so there's a little bit of thought as to wonder who the ones they didn't name were. And that's true all the way through translations like the New Revised Standard Version today. It's a team of people working on it, often scholars. Sometimes a few sort of well-thinking pastors get included in that, but it's usually a team of scholars that work on a version. A paraphrase, on the other hand, is often, not always, but often the work of a single individual or a small group of individuals, a cadre of people, as opposed to a team. The person who's doing the paraphrasing is often just as scholarly, if not more so, than the people who work on a version, but it's often the result of just a very small number of people. Then also, the other thing that needs to be said about versions versus paraphrases is that a version, for the most part, tends to try to stick to what the manuscripts actually said. So it works, if not on a word-for-word kind of translation basis, certainly on a thought-for-thought basis. But it sticks as close as it can. Paraphrase, they're willing to be a little freer with that and add a little bit to it. If those of you who were here last week, if I stretch even the idea of a paraphrase, we could then end up with the VUV. That's a really loose paraphrase. Which brings us to this. There's two theories, really, as to how you go about translating. And you know these, though you may not know them by the terms I'm going to use in just a moment. So all I'm going to do is just name those, and then I'm going to say what they really are. The first, which is much more formal, is and that's what it's called, the formal way to translate is word for word. You put the text in front of it. This is how, if you had grown up in the 1800s and you went to something more than just a little one-room country shack, your Latin or Greek teacher would open up the book and you translated word for word. So that childhood Latin is really what lies behind a lot of our biblical translations today. The other form is called dynamic. Nobody knows what the word dynamic means today. It's one of those words that we picked up 50 years ago that was exciting and novel and ooh, ooh, ooh. If it was a dynamo or dynamic, then there was something to it. Well, all it really means is it's kind of just keeps on going. It's kind of alive. Well, so there's a dynamic translation method, and that's the more thought-for-thought version. You don't need to remember formal or dynamic, but formal is narrative. It's prosaic. It's put it into prose. Dynamic is more poetic. So if you've got an ear for how language works, certainly there are a few writers who have it. But most writers, they really are prosaic. They're just not real good. But a poet, you know, you can suck on those words and taste them like, just chew on them or suck on them like a piece of chocolate and enjoy them. And the more you do that, the more depth you discover in the midst of what it is you're reading. That's the difference between a version and a paraphrase. One's prosaic, one's more poetic. There are handouts on each of the tables. Martin Luther's hymn, Ein feste Burg, a mighty fortress is our God. The first column has the German. If you can't read that, well then there's a word-for-word translation in column 2. If you can kind of at least look at a language and realize whether it rhymes or has meter, you can look back at column 1 in the German and see that there's some rhyming going on in those lines. If you look at column 2, that's not happening. It's just really it's just a word-for-word translation, and that's all it is. Column 3 attempts to kind of turn it back into a hymn. Column 4, which is the version that most of us sing today. Column 3 is what you would have been singing back in the 1850s. Column 4 is the way Ein Festgeburt has been translated today, and you'll notice that it maintains meter and it maintains rhyme, just as the original in the German did. But it's looser. If you compare column 4 to column 2, well, you know, they've taken some liberties. But when you look a little closer, you can kind of go, okay, yeah, they've taken liberties, but that gets the idea across. They didn't just stick in words that rhyme. They used some appropriate words. That's the difference between a version and a paraphrase. So with that, let's jump and spend some time with paraphrases today. Just before we started this morning, Andrew asked me a question about the American Standard Version. Well, this very first version that I want for us to look at today takes us right back to that time. The American Standard Version was completed by a whole team of scholars that just revised the British version, and they spent a bunch of years working on it. The 20th century New Testament was not done by a team of scholars, though it was done by a team of, you know, halfway smart people. There were some pastors involved. There weren't any, other than being headmasters of sort of elite schools. In that sense, there were some scholars, but there were headmasters. There were a very small number of clergy, a bunch of housewives, and then just some kind of smart guys that didn't have anything else to do, so they sat around and translated out of Greek into English and focused on the Bible. And they got together over a 25-year period. They didn't get together in person, but they got together through letters that they would send back and forth to each other. Well, this is the way I've translated. This is the way and compare notes and look at what each other had done. What they wanted to accomplish was to create a version of the Bible that was, and keep in mind, this is just right after the revised version has come out, and that's the only thing that is there other than the King James. So their main focus is to create a text that is easy to read, that their children would be able to read and understand, or that the general populace would be able to do that with. It actually is pretty good. It's hard to find. You can find it on the used book market, but that's the only place you're going to find it today. Although you can find it, of course, online. It's like everything else on the internet these days.
Can you find it in your office?
You can find it not in my office, but I did bring some other ones. That's what this table is full of over here. I've got 3 examples of what the 20th century New Testament did in terms of sort of elucidating what King James, as well as the Revised Version, didn't do a very good job of helping you to know what it meant. Here's the way that King James had this verse from Matthew 26. And I have highlighted some words that are often misunderstood in English. It's not that you don't know what any of those words mean. It's just that you have a little trouble knowing necessarily what they mean as they are put next to each other. Is it all the people drink, or are people supposed to drink all of the beverage? Which is it? Well, it kind of matters because we're talking about that stuff that's in a chalice, you know? So here's how the 20th century New Testament translated that. And they just put it in nice, simple English so that you knew who was supposed to do the drinking and how much drinking you were supposed to do. Just well done. Well, here's another version. This verse in Acts is not important in the big scheme of things for anything at all, except that you read that last line and you go, what the heck? What does that even mean? Well, the 20th century version took that on and said, here's what it means. It's like, oh, okay, yeah, that's exactly what it means. I get it now. And incidentally, I took time last week, as well as the week before, to really draw attention to the fact that in the big scheme of things, there's not a whole lot of difference between a King James and a revised version, or an NIV, or even an NRSV. For the most part, they look alike, they read alike, they are revisions of each other. There's reasons why they all sound alike. But part of the reason that you can go back and read a King James and understand it is because you were taught what those words meant. Somebody who didn't grow up with it really struggles with the King James. I always hated it, incidentally, when I had a wedding to officiate at, and the young couple wanted me to read 1 Corinthians 13, of course it was that. They wanted me to read 1 Corinthians 13 out of the King James. Well, I read that passage who knows how many hundreds of times growing up, but when you're reading something that's in real English, and then you go back and you read it in King James and you have to do it out loud so that people can get it, suddenly your tongue gets all tangled up and it doesn't make a whole lot of sense what it is that you are saying. We need help understanding the King James, and the 20th century did a good job there. And here's one more. This phrase that Paul used, that we may even have quoted at some level or another. Reading the King James can lead to all kinds of weird conclusions. So the 20th century helped us out. It's not that you're supposed to become stoic or care less. It's that you're not to get bent out of shape. Well, okay, that works. And much, incidentally, of what the 20th century New Testament did gets incorporated in all the 20th century and after 20th century translations moving forward. They really did a nice job. Another paraphrase that was created was by a gentleman named Weymouth, and you probably have never even heard the guy's name. This was a British Baptist layman. He was headmaster of a school. As he got toward the end of his life and had retired from being the headmaster of a rather elite school in London, he, thinking back over his lifetime of work, realized that many of the young boys that he was working with really didn't understand the Bible very much at all, and he wished that there had been a translation available for them. And so he spent his retirement years after being a headmaster creating a version of the New Testament that children, boys in the schools that he had been a part of, would be able to understand. What's neat about what he accomplished, if you were to read it today, you'd think, well, that's not any much of a much, but we're 100+ years after people have been doing this, and so it doesn't seem that novel. But at the time, he worked really hard to put himself into the position of those apostles who were writing, for instance, the Gospels, and realizing that each Gospel sounds rather different than the others. He tried to think as Matthew or think as John, and then write or translate as if he were Matthew or John. It's the same thing that you have to do if you are an editor and you're doing either some editorial work to make somebody actually sound good, like they knew what they were doing, or if you're doing some ghost writing, you can't just make them all sound like you. You have to get into their head and make them sound like them too. So that's what Weymouth did. That was really a pretty neat thing. You may, if you read a lot of different Bibles as a young person, you may have had a Moffat Bible. Did anybody have one growing up? This is the first really, really serious English paraphrase. And it's a delightful paraphrase. It's British, but it's a delightful one in most ways. You can see when he's beginning to work. It's right at World War I. This Bible and his work becomes a foundation for a lot of, if you are clergy, for a lot of commentaries. Commentaries will take a version of the Bible and build their commentaries off of that version of the Bible. There are multiple commentary sets that are built off Moffat Bibles throughout the mid-20th century. It was a rather free rendition of the New Testament into British English. And whether you are liberal or evangelical or somewhere on that spectrum, folks have often said that Moffat is one of the best entree points into understanding what Paul meant or what any of the prophets meant. He really did a wonderful job of kind of getting into the head of those persons. The one issue, and this really is an issue, for whatever reasons, Moffat was rather full of himself, and so he thought he knew better how each of those persons should have written or how they did write. And so he often functioned what I would say is kind of a bad editor. He took chunks of Jeremiah and just rearranged them however he thought it should have been. He did it with the Gospel of John. He did it with every book. He just sort of moved stuff around because he thought it sounded better and made more sense. Well, I wouldn't suggest that that's the best way to go about translating the Bible, but it's still the case that even having done that, which introduces a lot of weirdness in some ways, it still ends up being one of the best ways to get us to understand Paul or understand many of those Old Testament prophets. Here's his translation of 1 Corinthians 13. It doesn't sound all that unique to us today, but it really was when it came out. This is a paraphrase. Love is very patient, very kind. Love knows no jealousy. If you know what it sounds like in the King James or even the NRSV, you can read this and go, oh, wow, that's pretty good. The American version of Moffat was Goodspeed. Did any of you own a Goodspeed Bible when you were younger? Did y'all own Bibles when you were growing up?
King James.
Yeah, okay. Prayer book, yeah, okay. Goodspeed was a professor at the University of Chicago. He taught Greek at the University of Chicago. And he too, in the mid-20s, created this wonderful American version of a New Testament paraphrase. It was so good that no sooner did it get published than his school said, you need to do an Old Testament version of that. And his response was, I teach Greek, not Hebrew. And so he got a couple of his buds in the Hebrew department to create a team of 4 to then create the Old Testament version of Goodspeed. Phillips. Did any of you have a Phillips Bible? All right, now we're getting into the era. Well, now we're past World War II at this point in time. Phillips also is a delightful version, and I think I did not bring a Phillips with me.
Probably because they fall apart.
Well, the hardback versions are a little easier on. If you're wanting to be able to understand Paul, a Phillips translation is wonderful. Phillips is British, or if he wasn't British, he was American, but at any rate, he was in London at World War II. And he was realizing that many of the kids wandering around, underground where you stayed away from the bombing, nobody seemed to know the Bible anymore, or if they did look at a King James, they couldn't understand it, and so he started translating for those folks hanging out underground in London during World War II. And it's just a marvelous translation. If you haven't read a Phillips or haven't read one for a while, at least go back and read through the letters of Paul or the other letters by John or Peter, etc. It's really a good way for folks who aren't necessarily biblically scholarly to be able to understand what it is that those folks were talking about. You did have a living Bible, right?
No.
Ken Taylor often gets pretty bad press for the Living Bible. Some of it is probably okay that he gets bad press, but much of it is really not earned. The guy was a pretty brilliant New Testament scholar. He worked at Moody Press in Chicago. As a side note to that, the Living Bible sold so many copies. He actually did not himself personally reap the benefits of that. He put it into a trust, and he started a press on the side. Tyndall Press is the creation of Ken Taylor. So he did not become stinky rich because of the Living Bible. He made sure that wasn't the case.
I worked there.
Did you work there?
For 4 years, and Ken Taylor was also a very nice man. He was quite old when I met him.
Yeah, he hasn't been dead all that terribly
Yeah.
many years at this
But yeah,
point.
the Taylor family in general, really nice people.
Well, good. Thank you for saying that.
Yeah. And a lot of that money also went to missions. I mean, they gave gobs and gobs of money.
Yeah. That makes me think, this has nothing to do with what we're talking about, but Domino's Pizza, Catholic layperson started that, and much of the profits go to missions. You might want to go buy a Domino's Pizza at some point. I did my Christian service today. Ken Taylor created what becomes known as the Living Bible so that he would have a version of the Bible to read to his children at their devotions before they went to bed at night. That's how the Living Bible started. Devotions for his children. That NLT, there's actually a new version of the Living Bible that has come out. The Living Bible, if you can remember back, it had that green padded covers. And it really was a fairly free paraphrase. I mean, there were portions of it is like, well, how do you get this from that? But it was always really easy to read. The new version of the Living Bible, New Living Translation, was done by a team, not by an individual. And this has got to have, at some level, Ken rolling over in his grave, but they decided they were going to get away from the paraphrase and go back to a version. And so they got rid of the freeness of the Living Bible translation. It's called the New Living, but it's not at all like the Living. It's just like the NRSV and everything else is these days. It's written in normal English, not Living Bible English. about the time I was starting seminary, they came out with the Reader's Digest Bible, which I blew a gasket over. I thought, how in the world can you abridge the Bible? You know, now I've read some novels that were Reader's Digest, condensed books, you know, which was always good, but not the Bible. Well, they worked on it for 20 years, deciding whether they were or weren't going to translate and abridge this particular classic. The folks who worked on abridging the Bible were some of the premier scholars in the world. Those of you who've gone to seminary or had anything to do with, you know, the upper echelons of biblical stuff, Bruce Metzger is a name that you're going to know. He's the editor of the Reader's Digest Bible. It is blue blood all the way through. They decided in abridging the Bible that there were certain things they weren't going to abridge. You couldn't end up with 7 commandments, for instance. You couldn't have a shorter Lord's Prayer or fewer Beatitudes. And you couldn't take out any of those pieces about love in 1 Corinthians 13. And there were a few other passages. Those were hands off. But it turned out that the Old Testament got reduced by about 50%, to which most people said, thank goodness. You know? And the New Testament was reduced about 25%. Well, you know, all you have to do is get rid of, there are lots of places, both in Old Testament and New Testament, both in Hebrew and Greek, where it will say, and he answered and said. Well, you cut out 50% of that just by saying he said, or varying it and saying he answered. You don't have to say he answered and said. And you can up it to 60% if it's and he answered and said, and you just say he said. So, you know, and if you know the way Hebrew poetry works, line 2 is just a variation of line 1. You can get rid of half the Old Testament just by deleting one or the other line. They didn't do that, but it's easier once you get started on abridging than you might think. And you can do it in a way that really does adhere to the original. In fact, in some ways, you might even claim in the same way that if you read a Reader's Digest condensed book, you say, well, that's better than the original was. The Reader's Digest is still poked fun at, but it really has some good scholarly chops behind it. The primary form of paraphrase that's out today is Eugene Peterson's The Message Bible. I have on a couple of times when I have preached here decided that I needed to reintroduce the text and read a message version, because it really does sort of elucidate what's being said in some important ways. Eugene Peterson's dad was a butcher up in Montana, and that's where he was headed, except he was a brilliant kid and becomes an Old Testament scholar. Chooses not to become a professor at a university. He becomes clergy, he becomes a Presbyterian clergy, and starts a new church outside of D.C., Bel Air, Maryland. And so his church is filled with new Christians, or people who have come back to faith and sort of started over again in life. Well, as he's preaching, and this is a church that just really boomed in terms of size, he preached well. He wrote 50, 75 books by the end of his life. All of them are worth reading, incidentally. But when he preached, he realized that his congregation didn't have a clue about the text, the basis of what he was preaching. And so to help out, he began saying, well, okay, they don't know what that says, so I'm going to translate it and read my translation to them on Sunday mornings. Well, for many people, that was more popular than even the sermons were. And they began saying, you need to publish that. Well, he tried that a little bit. And people that had nothing to do with his congregation said, you need to do more of that. Eventually, he gets the entire Bible translated, and we know it as the Message. It's not just that the translation is wonderful. The introductions to each of the books are literary masterpieces. If you read in the front of your Bibles, if you've got a study Bible, if you read the introduction to a particular book, it will say, this was written by so-and-so about this particular point in time, and here's the various themes that it looks at, and here's an outline. And it's like, yawn, that really makes me want to read this particular book. Here's Peterson's introduction. I can't read it all, it's a little too long for that. But here's his introduction to the book of Ruth. As we read the broad, comprehensive biblical story of God at work in the world, most of us are entirely impressed. God speaking creation into being, God laying the foundations of the life of faith through great and definitive fathers and mothers, God saving the people out of a brutal slave existence and then forming them into lives of free and obedient love. God raising up leaders who direct and guide through the tangle of difficulties, always involved in living joyfully and responsively before God. Very impressive. So impressive, in fact, that many of us, while remaining impressed, feel left out. Our unimpressive, very ordinary lives make us feel like outsiders to such a star-studded cast. We disqualify ourselves. Guilt or willfulness or accident makes a loophole, and we assume that what is true for everyone else is not true for us. We conclude that we are somehow just not religious, and thus unfit to participate in the big story. And then we turn a page and come on this small story of two widows and a farmer in their out-of-the-way village. It keeps going. Now, if that doesn't capture your attention in a way that you go, okay, come on, finish the introduction so I can turn the page, and you want to go and read it. That is what an introduction to a book ought to do. Martin Buber, who had a wonderful book, came out, I don't know, somewhere around 1960 called I and Thou. It was one of those books that just sort of turned the religious world upside down for a few years. Wonderful book, but the translation by Walter, whatever his name is, he also wrote an introduction to I and Thou. Read the introduction and forget the book. It's the introduction that is way, way better than the book itself was. Peterson's introductions are just marvelous. Here's his version of the Lord's Prayer. Now, incidentally, I said he was an Old Testament scholar. So he was also very interested in spirituality. Now, I don't mean anything Zen or Buddhist, etc., but he's just very interested in connecting the prayer life, etc. And so he thought we had completely messed up the Psalms. They had become stately. You had to wear a tuxedo as you read the Psalms. He thought they needed to get down in the dirt again and be stark cries out of the mud to God for deliverance. That kind of an idea. So you see a little bit of that even in the Lord's Prayer. Now, we probably have a little bit of trouble praying that together on a Sunday morning. And notice he has done something that every contemporary Bible has not done. We still do it on a Sunday morning, but the doxology at the end of the Lord's Prayer that is deleted in any Bible you can put your hands on, he retains. So this doxology that sounds kind of weird to us, this is, for thine is the kingdom, you're in charge, and the power, you can do anything, and the glory, your blaze and beauty. Amen. Yes, yes, yes. I like it. I don't know that I want to stand up in church and go, yes, 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 but I like it. And here's a version of what shows up just right around, where the fruit of the Spirit is, but here's the other side, the fruit of the flesh. Well, that's a wonderful list. Well, it's a terrible list, but it's a wonderful way of describing the list. Now, if you read most of this is just words or 2 or 3 words in your Bible, reading this portion of Galatians. If you read that and then read this, you go, wow, I might be willing to do something about my sins if this were the description, as opposed to those words that I didn't even know what they were in the translation. And his concluding comment, it's just so apropos. I could go on. Did any of you, when you were younger, get or read some Cotton Patch Bibles? New Testament only, but Clarence Jordan was a Baptist, Southern Baptist, who, like some other Southern Baptists, were sort of on the front line of civil rights stuff at that particular moment in our American history. Starts a farm, Koinonia Fellowship Farm, down in rural Georgia, that is an integrated farm. Not the place to integrate a farm if you want to have a nice, simple life where people leave you alone. He was not left alone. His farm was not left alone. It was a bone of contention of all sorts. But he did what most everybody else said you ought to do, but never quite got, because it was dangerous to do that stuff, other than just say that's what people ought to do. Incidentally, at the end of his life, a guy by the name of Millard Fuller and his wife came to Clarence Jordan's Koinonia farm and they became big buds. You don't hear Clarence Jordan's name connected to Millard Fuller and his wife because he ends up having a heart attack and dies right as Millard Fuller is getting ready to do his first big thing over in Africa. Do you know who Millard Fuller is? Habitat for Humanity. Got its start with Clarence Jordan at Koinonia Farms. This isn't the actual letters, but here's what the titles to Paul's letters, and it gives you a sense of what the Cotton Patch versions are like. Well, I might like to read the letter to the Alabaster African Church of Smithville, Alabama. And here, just really a pedestrian passage, but here's his description of John the Baptist from Matthew chapter 3. So one day, John the Baptizer showed up and he started preaching in the rural areas of Georgia. Incidentally, he transforms the New Testament into Southern America, not South America, but Southern America. So one day, John the Baptist showed up and he started preaching in the rural areas of Georgia. Reshape your lives, he said, because God's new order of the Spirit is confronting you. This is what the prophet Isaiah meant when he said, a voice is shouting in the rurals, lay out the Lord's highway, straighten his roads. Well, this guy John, he was dressed in blue jeans and a leather jacket, and he was living on cornbread and collard greens. Folks were coming to him from Atlanta and all over North Georgia and the backwater of the Chattahoochee. And as they owned up to their crooked ways, he dipped them into the Chattahoochee. And it just keeps right on going. And, you know, if you don't like Southern ways of talking, you ain't going to like the Cotton Patch New Testament. But if you're okay with that, and if you're okay with somebody sticking a boot up your nose a time or two, or dumping your back end in the mud on something that you're reading, it's worth, you know, it's dated now. This isn't going to be something people read other than just go, you ought to read this kind of thing. But it was important, especially for younger folks, deciding whether they should or shouldn't get involved in civil rights stuff at the time.
Yeah. If you read the story of the prodigal son in the Cotton Patch, it is priceless.
Yeah.
It is priceless. Yeah.
I should have, well, that, I
It's too long, but.
couldn't have fit it here, but yes.
What were the dates on that again? Was it 70s?
Yeah, he dies, he's still working on it, so like the Gospel of John isn't finished because,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's where it ends, but a lot of it was in the 60s when he was putting it together.
Yeah.
Was he black? Or?
No,
No.
no, very much a white man.
That would make some difference.
Yeah, it would and it did.
Was he friends with Jimmy Carter? Since his farm was
Yes.
integrated?
Yes. Yep, Carter liked him, Carter hung out with him.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, by the way, down south, you can call him Clarence Jordan.
That's true too.
That sounds right.
Yeah, it's the Jordan River for sure.
The Jordan, yeah.
Okay, a variation on a paraphrase is an expanded text. This British guy did a wonderful one. An expanded edition of the Bible is really scripture and commentary wed together. Why just use one adjective or one noun when you can use 10? Well, you know, what is teaching if you don't do something like that? So that's what Wes does in his translation. So here's a passage that we know. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we beheld his glory. The glory is of the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth. It's a little longer here. But he adds enough in there so that you get a sense of what it means to say, and he dwelt among us. The phrase is really intriguing in Greek, and he pulls that out. God put up a tent and lived among us in a tent, intending to be there for a while. It's the incarnation that's being talked about there. The one that you may have seen, though, was the Amplified Bible. When I first came across an Amplified Bible in high school, I thought I died and gone to heaven. It was one of those wonderful things that I came across. Here's kind of what they did with the Beatitudes. stuff in red is the stuff that they add, the amplified part. Again, what does it mean to be blessed? Well, so they tell you what it means to be blessed or to be poor in spirit. It's amplified. You don't need to buy a bunch of commentaries if you've just got the Amplified. It was a way to study for people who were learning.
Who wrote that one?
A whole bunch of folks did. It was not just a single individual. All right, parallel Bibles. Parallel Bibles put two or more translations side by side. So there may be on one page King James Bible, and on the second page the Living Bible. So if you really liked the Living Bible, but you wonder sometimes, well, what did that really say? Then you could look over on the other page and see it. So it was like having two Bibles right there in front of you. Sometimes there were as many as 4. 2 columns on one page, 2 columns on it. And you might have the King James and the Revised Standard Version and the NIV and the Message, side by side by side by side, so that you could study them as you were doing your devotionals on a daily basis. Sometimes a parallel Bible has one of the columns in Greek, if it's a New Testament book. Some of them will have the Hebrew for Old Testament, or some of them will have the Septuagint, a Greek translation of the Old Testament available. And then there are harmonies of the Gospels, another slightly different version. These will take, obviously it's limited to just the Gospels, but it will take Luke and Matthew and Mark and maybe even John and lay them out side by side so that you know how each dealt with that particular story. How does John's version of the feeding of the 5,000, for instance, differ from Matthew's version? Well, rather than having to switch back and forth and do this with your Bible or have 2 Bibles, this just lays them all out side by side so that you can at a glance see what this person adds or that person deletes or the direction that they take with something. And it's really pretty helpful. Another version is an interlinear. An interlinear will have either the Hebrew or the Greek, and then put a word-for-word translation right underneath it so that you see what it is, and then in a column over to the side will give you like the NIV or the NRSV version, so you can get from the wooden word-for-word to something that reads like you and I would speak in English. And it's a wonderful way to be able to study the Bible. Which leads then to study Bibles, since we've got 2 or 3 minutes left. If we go back 300 or 400 years, all Bibles were study Bibles. But then there went through a big several centuries where they didn't do, all you had was just the Bible. Starting about 1900, study Bibles came back into vogue. And it's a wonderful thing that they did. A study Bible will include maps so that you actually see where Jerusalem is. Or it will have charts available for you to look at, or lists, or illustrations, or indices that you can read. Pretty extensive book introductions so that you know what it is you're getting ready to look at. There'll be essays on the page to read. There'll be cross-references, cross-indexed references. So if you're looking at John 6 and a particular statement in John 6, you'll know that that same word or same idea shows up over in Matthew 15. And so if you want to, you can go over and see how it gets used there and compare and contrast it and learn something along the way. There are even study Bibles that are known as chain reference Bibles. In the margins, they will have hundreds and hundreds of other verses to look at to be able to see how that word gets used somewhere else in the Bible. And there are all kinds these days, because publishers realize they could make big bucks on this. You can take a $5 Bible and sell it for $60, call it a study Bible. You got to put something in it to be able to make up the difference, but they do. And they've learned that they can create a study Bible for anybody of any stripe. So there are children's study Bibles, there are teen study Bibles, there are youth study Bibles, there are men's study Bibles, there are women's study Bibles, there's African American study. You get the idea. In addition, there are even Bibles like archaeological Bibles. The notes in these particular Bibles are keyed then to what your interest might be. So in the archaeological study Bibles, they often reference, if you're reading through an Old Testament passage or a New Testament, that here's where a dig has taken place, and here's some of the things that they have found, and here's a picture of what that particular place looked. So if that's an interest of yours, you can get an archaeological study Bible and learn all kinds of things by reading it. Most study Bibles of any stripe or variety are worth getting. But there are some to avoid. Some are not as good as others. They're all, to some degree or another, agenda-driven. Some agendas aren't as good as other agendas. So two I would suggest, since it's about time to stop here, that you might want to avoid. One would be a Ryrie Study Bible. A Ryrie Study Bible focuses on the dispensations under which God has worked in the world. I'm not going to go into any, just avoid chain reference. Or a Ryrie Study Bible, avoid those, and also avoid a Schofield reference. Schofield was a door-to-door salesman who realized he could make buku bucks off Bibles, selling them door to door. He also believed in something called premillennial dispensationalism. All that stuff that you think evangelicals believe, and it's why you don't like them, number one, ain't true. But number two, is true of a Schofield reference Bible. Well, from about 1910 to 1940, Schofield reference Bible salesmen are going door to door throughout rural America selling these things at dirt cheap prices. Everybody's buying Schofield reference Bibles. And it's filled with premillennial dispensationalist notes everywhere. I mean, this is the stuff that turns into, Jesus is coming back and there's going to be a 1,000-year reign and there's a rapture that's going to get us all out of here. Some of that stuff's in the Bible, much of it's not, but it's sure in a Schofield reference Bible. And so in the same way that by sticking Ussher's chronology into King James Bible, everybody thought that the world started in 4004 BC, anybody who buys a Schofield reference Bible and realizes that's just the notes, not the actual text, start thinking that that's what the Bible teaches. Don't buy a Schofield reference Bible. But anything else is okay. And one last note to finish us off here. There have been a whole lot of Bibles that have turned out children's Bibles. The New International Version, for instance, has what they call a New International Reader's Version. Most Bibles are keyed to about a 7th or 8th grade reading level, incidentally. New International Reader's Version is keyed to a 3rd grade reading level. When the New International Reader's Version came out, it suddenly became a bestseller. Everybody wanted an NIRV because they could understand it. And so it ceased being targeted, marketed for 3rd and 4th graders, and was beginning to be targeted for English as second language readers and people who were struggling to read. Their literacy levels weren't high. If you compare a NIRV to an NIV, you realize, wow, they did a really good job of simplifying it and remaining true to the text. It has a vocabulary of like 4,000 to 5,000 words. And on the basis of the NIRV, across the board, all these other translations decided we can make money at that too. And they began making their own versions, children's versions of their Bibles. Okay, thanks for sticking out to the bitter end on all of this. We have started with Old Testament and New Testament context, culture, worked our way through the Apocrypha and the pseudepigrapha of the Old and New Testament, and then marched very quickly through several hundred years of translations into English, and we are left with where we are today.
Do we have an AI one yet?
Do we have a what?
Artificial intelligence.
We do. Well, you know, I'm sure we do, but I don't know anything about it and don't want to know anything about it.
Well, go into Google and put that in.
AI Bible?
Entire Bible, and then get the AI version that I'm sure they'll send you.
Probably so, probably so. Avoid that one too, along with science fiction. All right, I have no idea where we're headed in terms of Sunday school moving forward.
I guess I'm teaching something after each
After-
semester.
yeah, the
If
next-
you have any ideas about what you want that to be, just get in touch with me, because I haven't figured it out yet.
The next 2 weeks, there will not be Sunday
Yeah.
school, but following Easter then, Benita is on tap. Thanks for taking part.
Thank you.